I'm allowed. Professor Aaronson is currently appointed as Professor of Urology and Pediatrics and is Chief of Pediatric Urology at the Medical University of California and the Medical University's Children's Hospital, respectively. Please welcome Professor Aaronson.
Thank you very much. Good, well done. Can we just check, is the microphone audible? Yes or no? I couldn't hear that. Is it? Sorry. How about that? Is that better? Yes. Good. No, still not. What can we do? Hang on, we'll try that now. How's that? Are we getting better by the second? Yes, however. Well, I'll do my best not to turn my head around because that was sabotage this last time. Well, first of all, can I thank you all for coming? I recognise lots of old friends and I thank you for your loyalty. That's, I should be offering frequent flyer points, shouldn't I, every time you come to one of these lectures? Water. Indeed. Well, we're embarking together on a 5-day journey to explore the relationship between genius and madness. There is enough tantalizing evidence to suggest that this relationship does indeed exist. For example, we have, of course, the greatest physicist since Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, who was decidedly eccentric. What is not widely known is that he had a son, Edward, who was schizophrenic and confined to a mental institution for the greater part of his adult life. Being schizophrenic certainly doesn't preclude exceptional achievement. And here we have the American mathematician John Forbes Nash, who was also afflicted with schizophrenia, which did not stop him being awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1994. Depression, however, seems particularly prevalent among artists, writers, and composers. For example, Robert Schumann tried to commit suicide at the age of 44 by jumping off a bridge over the River Rhine. He was admitted to a mental institution where he died 2 years later. And Virginia Woolf, a lifelong sufferer from recurrent bouts of depression, one day feeling yet another episode coming on, put on her overcoat, filled its pockets with stones, and walked into the river at the end of her garden and drowned herself. And then, of course, there was Sylvia Plath, the poet, who, feeling that she couldn't go on with bouts of depression, lay down in the early hours of the morning in her kitchen, put her head in the gas oven, turned on the gas, and died whilst her 2 infant children were sleeping in the room next door. She was just 30 years old. And then there was Mark Rothko, who at 9:05 in the morning, his laboratory assistant, his studio assistant, came in, heard the taps running, went to the back of the studio and found Rothko, who is now in his 60s, feeling that he had nothing more to contribute, lying dead in a pool of blood, having slashed his brachial artery in his forearm with a razor blade. But genius, mercifully, madness doesn't afflict all geniuses. And here we have Mozart in a portrait painted at the age of 7 during a sensational concert tour he gave in London. He died young, but as far as we know, of natural causes. And then, of course, the great Leonardo da Vinci, who enjoyed retirement in the court of the French King King Francis I. So we can see this panorama of mental illness that seems to dog highly talented people. But that's just circumstantial. I looked for a definition of what is it that distinguishes people like Einstein, Mozart, from people who are just very talented. And I came across this definition from the 19th century German philosopher Schopenhauer, who said, "Talent hits a target no one else can hit. genius hits a target no one else can see. So where does Michelangelo, sculptor, painter, and architect, fit into this picture? An undoubted genius, certainly in the eyes of Giorgio Vasari, the father of art history and a contemporary of Michelangelo's, who in his biography included of famous artists, was the only living artist to merit an entry. And he said of Michelangelo, he is undoubtedly a genius, perhaps the greatest genius who ever lived. What was the nature of this genius as a sculptor? His ability from apparently lifeless stone to create a sculpture with enormous emotional power, here, calm, concentration, strength. And here, his depiction of Adam at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel has been regarded as a perfection of Renaissance art. And then as an architect, here the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, not quite conforming to Michelangelo's original conception, which was of a hemisphere as opposed to an elongated structure that we see now by another hand. But that hemisphere was to inspire Sir Christopher Wren in his design of the magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the Pantheon in Paris, and indeed the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., all owing to Michelangelo. So who was this man, Michelangelo? Well, he was born in the Republic of Florence. Italy, of course, didn't exist as a nation in the 15th century, but the Republic of Florence, and he was born in 1475. His father was a low-level civil servant, in and out of work. They lived in genteel poverty. His mother died following the birth of their fifth child when Michelangelo was only 6 years old. His father sent him to his former wet nurse to be brought up, and the wet nurse's husband worked in a local stone quarry. And there, the young Michelangelo would follow him along and learn to manipulate the tools of a stonemason, and also came to recognize the different qualities of types of marble. He was a bright child, and his father, at the age of 10, enrolled Michelangelo in a grammar school. And a grammar school, the curriculum was largely in Latin, and they were grooming their pupils for service in the diplomatic corps, the law, and in the church. And Michelangelo's father was hoping that his son would become a bishop, thereby restoring the prestige of the family. For Michelangelo's father harbored the notion that he was descended from Florentine nobility, although the evidence for that seems to be lacking. In the grammar school, he met other young people, and out and about in town, he met other people, including this young man kneeling naked there. Can you see? He is a young apprentice to the painter Filippino Lippi. And the two of them became great buddies. Filippino Lippi was putting the finishing touches to this fresco that the great Masaccio had painted, but died prematurely and was unable to finish. And this young man, Francesco Granacci, much the same age as Michelangelo, became great friends. Granacci then moved on to work for Guaraudio, the painter of this work that you may well have seen in the Louvre, of an old man and his grandchild. And Guaraudio took young Francesco Granacci as an apprentice, where, working in the studio, Francesco took some of Guaraudio's drawings and gave them to Michelangelo, who followed him around, and Michelangelo copied the drawings with such precision and skill that it quite blew Francesco away. Guaraudio saw the drawings that Michelangelo was doing. Michelangelo was bitten by the artistic bug and dropped out of school, much to the chagrin of his father. Guaraudio saw the drawings that Michelangelo had done and took him into his own studio as an additional apprentice. Going to work every day in Florence to Guaraudio's studio, where he learned to grind paints, pigments, and just look at the basic techniques of fresco painting, he marveled at the artistry that was to be seen in the city of Florence. statues of Donatello, frescoes by Masaccio, and all, of course, dominated by Brunelleschi's magnificent dome over the cathedral there. Next to the cathedral, of course, was the baptistry with its magnificent doors of the gates of paradise in gilded bronze that you can see there by Lorenzo Ghiberti. So Michelangelo was simply overwhelmed with all this art that was his environment in which he was living and working. The splendours of Florence, as you know, of course, were largely due to the Medici family. And at the time that Michelangelo was apprenticed as an artist, the de facto ruler of Florence was Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lorenzo was always on the lookout for young talent to further glorify the Republic, because these city-states and republics were in rivalry one with another, particularly with Milan, where Leonardo da Vinci had gone to do his major work. So Lorenzo asks Ghiberti, he says, do you have any young apprentices that might be good for my court? Because I need some. I need, in particular, a young apprentice to replace my elderly chief sculptor, Bartoldi, who was really getting a bit past it. And knowing that Michelangelo had had some experience in a stone quarry, he thought, well, this might be a young man Bartoldi could train up potentially as a sculptor. And this is the earliest work that the 15-year-old Michelangelo did, virgin and child, as you can see, in marble, just quite small, about 3 feet by 4. And she looks rather stocky, and for a 15-year-old, I think we can excuse that, and also the little bit of clumsiness about the fingers there that you can see. But she's certainly monumental in proportions, and just look at the child, nestled up against his mother's breast, head turned away. And then, like a little vignette, there are 2 children on the stairs there. Can you see one just in the process of sliding down the banisters? And this movement is so typical of what we'll see in Michelangelo's late work. He then went on, 16 years old. This is a marble low relief, 3 feet square, Battle of the Centaurs, he called it, in which he has crammed, 16 years old, crammed no fewer than 25 figures, writhing and contorted, intertwining one with another. And now we begin to see something about Michelangelo's personality. Lorenzo sent his 2 young apprentices out to the Brancacci Chapel next to the Medici Palace in order to copy some frescoes that Masaccio had done here. And among the pupils sent out to do this copying was Michelangelo and another Italian young man who was 3 years Michelangelo's senior, Torrigiano was his name, who was descended from a noble family as opposed to Michelangelo, who was really the son of a very lowly civil servant. Michelangelo and Torrigiano were sitting side by side copying these frescoes, and Michelangelo kept looking at what Torrigiano was doing and telling him, it's no good, you've got that completely wrong, and this is what you should be doing. And this went on and went on and went on. To the point came that Torrigiano put down his paper, his pencils, stood up and landed Michelangelo a mighty blow on the nose, which broke his nose, a disfigurement which he would carry for the rest of his life. In 1492, Lorenzo the Magnificent died unexpectedly. And he had been more a father figure to Michelangelo than his own son, for living in the Medici palace as he was doing with his other young apprentice that he'd recruited, they were sitting at his own table in the evening for dinner. And so we could see that following the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent, Florence now fell into a state of chaos. Why? Because King Charles VII of France had laid claim through marriage to the crown of Naples and had advanced across the Alps with his army and was in the process of surrounding Florence on his way down. With no strong leadership in Florence, because Lorenzo was succeeded by his rather ineffectual son Piero. The citizens uprose because they were fearful that there was no defense of the city against Charles and his army. They rose up against Piero, who then fled the city. In the power vacuum was this man, a Dominican fire and brimstone priest called Savonarola. And Savonarola took great exception in all his preaching up until now to the exception to the mercantilism of Florence, of course, the wealthiest of all the Italian states. It was a mercantile society. And he took exception to this as being ungodly. And furthermore, he wanted to create in Florence a new society, a new Jerusalem on the Italian peninsula as a model, a beacon to all other nations. He also banished in a Puritan streak all art which represented nudity. Michelangelo was now 17 years old and without a patron. So he leaves Florence, not feeling there was any future for him there, and he goes to Bologna, where he met a banker who had heard of his skills as a sculptor and invites him to see in the cathedral in Bologna this extraordinary confection, which is in fact the tomb of St. Dominic. Its original sculptor had died prematurely before finishing the little statues that you can see around the top there in this confection, and asked Michelangelo, gave him a commission to finish off a couple of the small statues there and also a larger one at the base of this tomb. And here we see Michelangelo with his first complete freestanding sculpture of St. Proculus. And here you see features that we will come to recognize in a moment in his celebrated David sculpture. The posture, you can see one knee bent, leaning slightly forward, one hand raised, but particularly the frown on his eyes. Can you see his eyebrows there, frowning? And this is in a youngster here testing the water with free-form sculpture. And here is an angel he did to complete the bottom of the tomb. Rome, meanwhile, was nothing more than a provincial backwater compared to Florence. It was the seat of the papacy, of course, but that was about it. In Rome, cardinals lived well, and they vied one with another for prestige. And there was a cardinal by the name of Riario, who was having a new palace built for himself. And the palaces of cardinals had, of course, to have a sculpture garden. And he wanted a grand sculpture for his own, some sculptures for his own garden, and had heard of Michelangelo in Florence. He sent his banker from Rome to Florence to seek out this young man and to persuade him to accompany him back to Rome to meet Riario and to agree to a commission, which the 21-year-old Michelangelo did. So he returns. Michelangelo for the first time comes to Rome, and for the first time he sees sculptures of monumental proportions. In Florence he'd seen the work of Donatello, but most compared to the magnificent, tall statues of Roman emperors and gods, Donatello's work was diminutive in comparison. And now Michelangelo was in awe at the great stature of these creations, and Rome was particularly abuzz because another cardinal, a rival to Riario, had acquired this newly unearthed sculpture of Apollo, known as the Apollo Belvedere, which is in the Louvre, you may have seen. This, we believe, is a Roman copy of a Greek original, but nonetheless it was a most magnificent sculpture that this rival cardinal had installed in pride of place in his own sculpture garden. Riario takes Michelangelo aside and says, I need something to compare with this. And Riario, being a cardinal who enjoyed good living, said, Michelangelo, what about Bacchus, the Roman god of wine? Which seemed reasonable. Michelangelo works for 2 years on the statue, and this is what he produced. Riario was shocked. He was expecting that a god would at least be dignified, standard, perhaps a symbolic bunch of grapes. But instead, what Michelangelo has done is created this entirely tipsy figure, and you wonder whether he's going to be able to stand on his plinth or simply just keel over. There indeed is the bunch of grapes you can see there against his thigh, nestling against which is the figure of Pan. Rivalry was so outraged by this, he gave the statue to his banker. Word, meanwhile, got around among other cardinals that Michelangelo was in town, and among them was the ambassador of France to the Holy See, Cardinal Jean de Bellière. And Cardinal Jean de Bellière asked Michelangelo to come and see him because he wanted to commission a Pietà. Well, what is a Pietà? There's no reference in the New Testament to such a figure. It is a devotional work popular in Northern Europe, often executed in very rustic style, as you can see here, of the Madonna and the dead Christ on her lap. And de Bellière wanted this to be in marble, which Michelangelo agreed. Michelangelo travelled to Carrara, where the best marble is to be found, was away 8 months, and came back with what he thought was a perfect block of marble in order to carve this Pietà. And this is what he produced. Those of you who've been to St. Peter's in Rome will be absolutely awestruck by this work. It just absorbs you absolutely, totally, and is regarded, I think, universally as one of the high points of Western sculpture. Why is it so effective? Firstly, Jesus, at the time of the crucifixion, historically, was around 30 years old, we believe. Yet here he looks like a little child, nestling on his mother's lap. Why is there this illusion? Because Michelangelo has played a trick with us. He has made Mary much, much bigger than she would be in life compared to her 30-year-old son. And consequently, he looks diminished and vulnerable. And then look again at her face. Historically, she would have been well into middle age. And yet, when we look at her face, she has a combination of grief and tranquil serenity, the face of a 20-year-old. Tricks that Michelangelo employed in order to create this extraordinary effect. Having completed that, and he was just 24 years old when he completed that, can you believe? He was summoned back to Florence by the Council of the Wool Guild. And the reason for calling him back was that there was lying in a piece of wasteland in Florence, covered in weeds, a huge block of marble, 24 feet long, which had been brought there 40 years previously, from which it was planned that a sculptor would create the figure of David, David being the father figure, the symbol of the freedom of Florence. The sculptor had started on the feet and he'd envisioned a clothed figure of David, but Michelangelo was asked if he would now complete this. The marble was already there, huge block of marble, and he was asked if he would complete this figure of David, which he duly did. It took him 3 years to work on it, and here is the result. It stands 18 feet tall. As it was nearing completion, a committee was convened in Florence by the elders of the city, comprising 28 members of artists who included Botticelli, Filippino Lippi, and the great revered elder statesman of Italian art, Leonardo da Vinci. And their commission was to find a place suitable for such a work. Leonardo took one look at this, and he was very disparaging. He said, "It's no good at all. Look at the head, much too big. Look at the hands, much too big. And by the way, those genitals need to be covered up." And he was very disparaging of this and recommended to the committee that it be placed in some obscure place where it wouldn't offend Florentines. Luckily, he was overruled, and it was given a place of honor in the piazza in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, on a plinth which had been prepared for it, and over 3 days it was gently trundled across and mounted on this plinth where it stood for many, many years. The head was too big. Of course, Leonardo was right. But when looked at from 18 feet below, it looked just right. And had it been normal size head, it would have looked diminutive, and the whole effect of this intense concentration of David about to kill Goliath would be lost. The hands were also too big, but look at the engorged veins, look at the power in the hands of this young man. Every detail was beautifully rendered. The nipples there, you can see, the belly button, even the little opening at the tip of the penis there, down to his toenails, exquisitely rendered. Michelangelo's reputation was now firmly established. He was just 29 years old when he completed the David. His reputation was established, commissions were coming thick and fast, and here a little tondo, just a little round, low relief, and you can see the Christ child there on his mother's lap, turning round. It's unfinished, but he's turning round to look at what looks like a bird being offered by another child. So Michelangelo's take on traditional sculpture is completely unique. And here again, in what is known as the Bruges Madonna, because it's housed in a cathedral in Bruges in Belgium, here is the Christ child with the mother impassive, sitting there firm, but look at the child. He's just slipped off her lap in order that he can run off and play. This rivalry between Leonardo and Michelangelo was long-standing, and this is just a little anecdote for something that happened years later. But it seems an appropriate moment just to consider the relationship between the elder statesman of Italian art, Leonardo da Vinci, well-established and revered worldwide, and Michelangelo, the youngster and upstart. Michelangelo was forever disparaging Leonardo. He would stop people in the street and say, "Oh, that Da Vinci, hopeless sculptor." And in fact, sculpture, in fairness to Leonardo, was not his forte. He did a couple of sculptures which were not terribly well accepted, but that's not what Leonardo was all about. And then, of course, you just heard how Leonardo was disparaging of the David. Yet, the two of them had a mutual respect that they kept very much to themselves. What we're looking at here is the interior of the Palazzo Vecchio, outside which the statue of David would be situated. And we're looking at the grand hall, and on the left and on the right you can see what look like tapestries or paintings, I'm not quite sure which. But at the time, Leonardo had been commissioned to paint a fresco on the one side of the wall, a battle of Alighieri, one of the great triumphs of Florence against its enemies. That is now lost, sadly, but Rubens, when visiting Rome, saw the original before it was destroyed and did a drawing of what Leonardo had created. And you would have thought that the writhing soldiers on horseback fighting each other in this battle and others on the ground with swords raised and battle engaged, you would have thought that those had been painted by Michelangelo. Conversely, a year later, when that fresco was finished, the elders of the city asked Michelangelo now to do a complementary battle scene for the opposite wall, also sadly lost. But we do know from the records that Michelangelo borrowed a technique of fresco painting which Leonardo had invented, namely the use of the cartoon. The cartoon in this context is a large piece of paper on which you draw out the actual size of the person or subject that you want to portray in your fresco. You draw that out, and then you perforate at intervals along the lines of the outline, the figure that you're going to place. You place the paper against the wet plaster that's just been applied, because fresco painting, by definition, is fresh, fresco. It has to be painted quickly, so the pigment is drawn into the moist plaster, and as the water evaporates, the pigment is bound, and there it remains with all its vivid colours for centuries, if you do it right. So the cartoon is applied, the perforations are made, and then powdered charcoal is blown through the perforations. The paper is removed, and there is the outline of what you want to paint. And then in one day's work, you have to quickly paint, if you're a fresco painter, paint the work. And this technique, invented by Leonardo, was adopted by Michelangelo in his fresco there. So intense rivalry, bad-mouthing each other, incessantly, but secretly admirers of each other's work. Now, for the first time, Michelangelo's reputation had reached the point that the Pope himself, Julius II at the time, summoned Michelangelo to Rome. And he summons him to Rome because he has a project for him. He wants to have his tomb designed and built in anticipation of his eventual death. This is what popes do, apparently. So Michelangelo then travels he designs, I should just say that the Pope here, Julius II, was a man who had enormous sense of self-importance. And he wanted Michelangelo to design something really grand, certainly bigger and better than that of his predecessor, Pope Sixtus IV, after whom the Sistine Chapel was named. Michelangelo comes up with an enormous, grandiose, freestanding tomb which can be walked around, bigger than anything that ever had housed any pope's remains in the past. He goes off to Carrara in the mountains there, you can see right at the top right-hand corner there, the sea, and he's away for a whole year, securing enough marble for this enormous tomb project. The sheer logistics of getting huge blocks of marble down from the Carrara mountaintops down to the coast, put on a barge, taken up the Tiber to Rome, was just monumental, and it's not surprising it took a year to do that. Having brought the marble back to Rome for the tomb, and having Julius approved this grandiose concept that Michelangelo had, the Pope says to Michelangelo, "Stop, I have a much more urgent project for you. Put the tomb on hold." What had happened was that 30 years previously, Sixtus IV had commissioned and paid for the reconstruction of the private chapel in the Apostolic Palace, which was in a state of disrepair, and had it basically rebuilt. Now, 30 years on, with subsidence, the walls had separated a little bit, resulting in a great fracture across the roof of this chapel, which in honor of Sixtus, who paid for the reconstruction, is called the Sistine Chapel. This is an engraving of the chapel as it looked when Sixtus had finished the renovations. The ceiling there, you can see, is simply a starry sky. And Julius asks Michelangelo to come and paint the ceiling. The ceiling at the time was held together by iron chains. And whilst the engineers stabilized the walls so this wouldn't be an ongoing problem, Michelangelo was asked to repaint the ceiling as it was, with starry sky, but in the little triangular lunettes above the windows, you can see all the way around there, he thought it would be a good idea if he wouldn't mind just adding 12 apostles to add a little bit of extra decoration. Michelangelo was absolutely terrified because at this time he'd done no painting whatsoever. Sculpture of exquisite order, yes, but painting, no. And he did repairs back to Florence, where the elders of the city are horrified because there is constant fear that the Pope with his armies would invade Florence. And they said to Michelangelo, "We cannot afford to fall out with the Pope. Please go back and do what he wants." A whole year passes and Michelangelo begins to think of a grandiose scheme for the painting of the chapel. And what he comes up with is, as you well know, of course, the painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which contains over 300 individual figures. Not a single space is left bare. Here are the triangular lunettes, where the Pope wanted just the 12 apostles, and here he puts figures of the precursors of Christ sitting on the curve of the window there, as you can see, as if they're on flying carpets. Even the little spaces above there, he puts figures. And between the lunettes, you can see there, he has the prophets of Israel and 7 sibyls, sibyls being those who could foresee the coming of Christ. And he paints every conceivable space. Here is a ventilation grill we can see in the bottom left-hand corner there, and a space that nobody would give any second thought to, which he also puts figures in. Here, trompe-l'oeil architecture, columns, there are no columns there at all, but he's painted columns trompe-l'oeil as if there are low-relief sculptures there, and then under the columns where this little V appears and this ram's head, he's put 2 crouching figures because there isn't much room for them to do anything else but crouch. And then we come to the dome, the vault itself of the chapel. And there Michelangelo's conception was for 9 rectangular scenes from the book of Genesis. And in 5 of these, curiously, he depicts indeed God the Creator, there we see in the center. But look at those 4 figures large, naked youths, 20 of them in all, on the panels in the centre of the vault. When we look at them closely, some are clearly androgynous. Is this a boy? Is it a girl? We're not quite sure. Some are undoubtedly more masculine. Here we see a muscular youth looking startled, sitting on a trompe-l'oeil block of marble. Why on earth would Michelangelo put 20 nude male figures on the ceiling of the Pope's private chapel? Were they the acolytes of God? Or, more likely, was it simply for the pleasure of reproducing the naked male form? So he undertook this at the age of 30. He agreed to the project. He presented it to the Pope, who thought this was an excellent plan, and the project would take him 7 full years. 3 months were required simply to build the scaffolding, on top of which was a bridge which had to be bolted to the walls on which Michelangelo would work on the ceiling, and this would be moved around, disassembled, reassembled, moved around. Meanwhile, he was doing in his sketchbooks, as you can see here, the designs for these 300 figures, a monumental undertaking. While all this was going on, it took a year simply to prepare the ceiling. The iron chains could now be removed. Sand and lime was then applied to the whole of the ceiling to stabilize, and then day's work by day's work, little tiny areas, because fresco has to be done on the day, the painting was begun. And at the end of a year, perhaps a 7th or a 6th of the painting was complete. Michelangelo comes to the Sistine Chapel to begin work the next day and looks down on the ground and finds flakes of plaster, coloured plaster. And he looks up at the ceiling and realizes for the first time that his year's work is now crumbling and has turned green. Why? Because his assistant, Jacopo, in applying the plaster ready for the cartoon, the charcoal and the paint, all to be done in a day, had mixed the plaster with volcanic ash. Why, nobody knows. But volcanic ash retains water. And in normal fresco painting, the water would evaporate, having drawn in the pigment within a day or two. It's fixed forever. With volcanic ash, the moisture lingered and lingered and lingered, allowing fungus to grow. And this is exactly what happened to Leonardo's Last Supper, of course, when he was experimenting with painting. And so the whole of 1 year's work had to be scraped off and started all over again. He wrote in his diary, describing the physical anguish that he was going through doing this. This is popularized in the movie, of course. My belly, he said, shoved up against my chin, bent skyward, the nape of my neck pressed against my hump, for he did indeed have a little kyphosis. Hollow-chested like a harpy, my loins have climbed into my gut, which I think refers to an inguinal hernia that he probably developed or had anyway. But look at the result. He left this to last, the central panel, and this, of course, is on the 6th day God created man. We've already seen man extolled as the epitome of the male form in Renaissance painting, but there is the Creator himself, windswept. Can you see the wind blowing his hair, his sleeves rolled back, his beard blowing in the wind, with an intense frown of creation, the act of creation, the power of his face. And in the adjacent panel, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the banishment of Adam and Eve from the garden on the right-hand side. And now we see another aspect of Michelangelo's strange personality. He's now just 39 years old, 37 years old. And he rides off to see the Pope. The Pope is engaged in a battle on the outskirts of Bologna. And Michelangelo has been through his accounts, and he discovers that the Pope is in arrears, a notorious late pair anyway, but substantially in arrears with his retainer and his incremental payments for the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So he gets on a horse and he rides out, days riding, and arrives and seeks out the Pope. And he tells the Pope that he demands, if you please, demands payment of arrears for the Sistine Chapel, which is now completed. Later, years later, he wrote to a friend in a fit of deep depression. He wrote saying, please remember me and defend my dead painting, for I am not a painter. And indeed he wasn't, but he produced perhaps one of the finest masterpieces in the canon of Western art. As the Sistine Chapel was coming towards its completion, in the adjacent rooms, which were at the time the Pope's private library, a young painter was creating the School of Athens, a fresco on the right there, which was an absolute model of eloquence. And that young painter, of course, was Raphael of Urbino. And I think that's where we get the term urbane from, because Raphael was just 8 years junior to Michelangelo, 28 at the time, and had produced this magnificent series of frescoes for the Pope's private library. Raphael was everything Michelangelo was not. He was good-looking, he was courteous, he was elegantly courtly, effortlessly courtly. He was amusing, he was witty, he enjoyed good life, but most important of all, he came up with his work on time, as promised, on budget. Unlike Michelangelo, who was irascible, he was dismissive, he was bad-tempered, he would demand money up front, he would undertake grandiose projects, many of which he never even started, let alone completed. And he was constantly bad-mouthing, as we saw in that copying of the Masaccio in the chapel there, bad-mouthing any potential competitor or rival. Two couldn't have been more polar opposites. Michelangelo was now becoming paranoid about Raphael, and you might argue understandably so, with a young rival who was clearly becoming the favourite of the Pope. And who was the Pope now? Because shortly after the Sistine Chapel was reopened, the Pope, Julius II, died and was succeeded by the young son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, at whose table Michelangelo had sat with the Pope's father. The Pope took the name of Leo X. But he was born the same year as Michelangelo. They grew up together for years, 3 or 4 years, in the Medici palace. And so they were like brothers. And so the Pope wants to give Michelangelo, his brotherly friend, a commission now that the Sistine Chapel is finished. And he says to him, the church next to the Medici palace, you remember, San Lorenzo, is incomplete. The west door wall consists simply of brick, and it needs to be magnificently finished, come up with a design for that wall, which is brick. Michelangelo, with a grandiose concept, designs a great marble facade, a vast amount of marble needed for this project, and he presents that to his brother, as it were, Leo X, and he says to Leo, well, here is the design you wanted. It's going to cost you 35,000 ducats. Take it or leave it. Leo is stunned at his reaction, but accepts the commission. Michelangelo goes off to Carrara again. He's away for another 8 months, comes back with vast amounts of marble. And then he says to the Pope, oh, well, I have to tell you now that the price has gone up. It's now 70,000 ducats. And the Pope says there's simply nothing in the coffers to supply that, and the project is abandoned. Leo writes to Michelangelo, and he says, Leo X speaks to you as a brother, almost with tears in his eyes, but you frightened everyone, even popes. Subsequently, he writes to a friend to say, he's terrible. You can't deal with him. So we're beginning to see something of this strange personality of this genius, Michelangelo. Now he's looking for a commission, and the Pope says to him, well, let's just get on with Julius II's tomb, because he's now been dead for a year, and he needs to have his tomb. The grandiose project is way, way too grandiose for reality, and it's contracting down. Instead of being a freestanding structure, is now against the wall. St. Peter's is in the state of being rebuilt, so it can't be in St. Peter's, so it's in San Pietro de Vincoli. You've probably seen this, the statue of Moses. Why did he choose Moses as the centerpiece for Julius II's tomb? Because Moses, the father of the children of Israel, is regarded by the Catholic Church as the father of the popes. And so there is the papal patriarch, if you like, Moses. But just look at this Moses, almost twice life-size. sitting on a chair, but it looks as though he's just about to spring out of that chair. Look at the way his knee is bent there, his toes are arched, curled up. He's gripping tightly. We can see the veins on his left arm there, clutching under his arm the tablets of the law. Michelangelo has captured Moses at the moment he comes down from Mount Sinai with the tablets of the law, and what does he see? The children of Israel worshipping the golden calf. And he's so angered, the frown, the intensity of looks could kill. He's about to spring up, so angry is he with what he's seen. And this is the genius of Michelangelo, to convey all these emotions out of cold, apparently dead stone. And there is the final tomb, a pale shadow of Michelangelo's grandiose conception. But now Michelangelo was really feeling the heat. On one side of him there was the revered, respected, elder statesman Leonardo da Vinci, and on the other side the young upstart Raphael. And so Michelangelo was now becoming depressed, paranoid, but then suddenly light. The 38-year-old Raphael develops a fever, and within 3 days is dead. And Michelangelo feels a sense of relief that his rival is no longer there. But his relief was short-lived, because the Pope arranges for Raphael to have the grandest funeral that any artist had ever received. And when Michelangelo gets to hear about this, he sinks into another deep depression. And now another pope comes on the scene, because Leo dies prematurely young. Another pope on the scene now asks Michelangelo, this is the nephew of Lorenzo the Magnificent. It's a family business being a pope in those days. And he takes the name of Clement VII. And Clement says to Michelangelo, whom he remembers, he says, Michelangelo, we need you to work for the Pope's court, and what I'd like you to do, we need in Florence a chapel for the Medici family. There wasn't a dedicated chapel in San Lorenzo for the Medici family. And so Michelangelo goes back to Florence with a design and starts executing tombs for the Medici family, both living and already dead. And here, for the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, he builds, designs, and has constructed this tomb, which is interesting. You can see there the dead grandson at the back there, like a Roman in his toga sitting on a throne. But interestingly, we see for the first time a female body sculpted. And if we look carefully at the female, it's a model of elegance, I think you would agree, just the composition alone. But look at that female figure there, and there she is, and when we look closely, it seems almost as if the breasts are simply stuck on a male torso. Can you see the muscular thighs, the ripples of the muscles of the abdomen there? Which suggests to me that Michelangelo had an intrinsic discomfiture with the female body, and that's why he didn't produce female sculptures, nor indeed unclothed female figures in his painting to any extent. Michelangelo was also going a little bit off his rocker. His records show that at the time of the Medici tombs, he was in his studio daily counting the number of nails in his box where he kept the nails, believing that his studio assistant was stealing them. There was no evidence that he was doing so. So I put it to you on the evidence of that alone, that the paranoia that Michelangelo felt towards Raphael perhaps could be justified, a young rival, but now the nail story, really. So there's something in Michelangelo's psyche that is a little disturbing. While he was in Florence, he was asked also to design a library. He wasn't an architect at all, but he added a library to San Lorenzo. Here's the San Lorenzo, and you can actually see on the right-hand side of the screen there, can you see the west wall there with a blocked-in window and all brick? That was the marble part that Leo X had balked at paying 70,000 ducats to have that marble facade. So it's remained in brick even to this day. He designed a library which was very much in keeping with traditional architecture at the time, but Michelangelo's genius as an architect, and this is his first architectural endeavor, was the interior. The foyer to the library itself was dominated by an enormous descending staircase that widened as it went down and seemed to sweep and pour into the atrium rather like lava from a volcano. Now, that sort of interior design device is now commonplace, but that's the first time that a sweeping staircase had opened out into an atrium or foyer like that, thanks to Michelangelo. Furthermore, around the atrium were recessed columns, just partial columns sticking out. Again, something we're all too familiar with, a Michelangelo invention. All was not well in Rome, meanwhile. All this was going on in Florence. And what was happening now was that the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, wanting to bring the papacy under his domain, had led his army across the Alps, bypassing Florence, and was now surrounding and laying Rome to siege. The Holy Roman Emperor's army entered Rome, destroyed buildings left, right, and centre, so hardly any building remained unscathed. Clement VII escaped to the bastion of Castel San Angelo, which you probably know, just across the Tiber, and from there, this was an impregnable fortress, and from there one night he was secreted out and into safety. And this situation where the Pope was expelled from his own city clearly affected Michelangelo, who had to remain in Florence. And this denouement between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Holy See lasted for a full year until Clement VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V came to an agreement, and the Holy Roman Emperor was actually crowned in Rome as Emperor of Rome as well. So they came to a political settlement. At that point, Michelangelo felt safe to come back, and Clement was back reinstalled. And Clement said, here's the ceiling that we never saw in its entirety, of course, and you can see every square inch is covered with Michelangelo's 300 figures, but at the far end, the altar wall there was blank. And Clement says to Michelangelo, we need to cover that to match your magnificent ceiling. And I envision if you can design for us a scene of the Last Judgment. And that, in fact, is the picture, what we see now on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, the Last Judgment. There in the centre near the top is the Christ figure we'll look at in just a moment. You can see the vault at the top, completely covered like the ceiling, not a square inch. On either side of the Christ figure at the top are the saved, being drawn up to heaven, and below them the damned, descending down into hell. So at the top we can see Michelangelo's trademark writhing figures, right from that early sculpture when he was just 15 years old. Writhing figures manipulating the cross, and on the opposite side, manipulating a marble column. But the Christ figure alone caused a scandal. For the first time, Christ is depicted as a muscular young man without a beard. And furthermore, he was completely naked. It was only 18 years later that another pope called upon another artist to cover up all the nude figures, both in the ceiling and in the Last Judgment wall, with drapery, which we see now. But that was not Michelangelo's conception. Here we see the saved being drawn up into heaven, the damned descending down into hell, tumbling into the abyss. Look at the figures. Each one is a masterpiece by itself. And look how many dozens and dozens there are. And once they descend into hell, they're attacked by monsters. A great concept. Little vignettes abound in this masterpiece. Here we can see the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew, you remember. And there's St. Bartholomew's skin hanging down, being held up by this man here who's done the flaying. I suspect he's got a knife in his hand there with a beard. But look at the face. The face on the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew is that of Michelangelo himself, a figure of doom, hoping for salvation. For Michelangelo was a religious man. Towards the end of that east wall fresco, he had a fall and twisted his ankle, or something happened which confined him to bed for several weeks, when he sank into yet another depression. And writing to one of the few friends that he had, because he was nothing but a recluse, writing to a few friends, he said, "My home, where he lived, is a wretched cave. Human waste is piled up outside. I am alone and feel miserable, like a soul imprisoned within a vial." And in that mood, he painted for the Pope's private chamber the picture of St. Peter being crucified upside down, you remember. Above, storm clouds are gathering, and if you see there in the bottom right-hand corner, an abject figure with a beard, a golden cap on his head, arms folded, his clothes ragged, Michelangelo himself. And now the problem with St. Peter's was becoming acute. That pope had died, and now there's yet another pope, Paul III, his name he took, and he was very concerned about the reconstruction of St. Peter's, which had... That's right, let me just see there we are, let me just go back, there we are. That's right, he summons Michelangelo and says, look, I have a problem with St. Peter's here. It's state of disrepair, it's being built and then rebuilt, and then we're having architects designing walls which are then taken down because a new architect wants the wall in a slightly different position. Michelangelo, you have great talent. I have great confidence in you. I want you to become the chief architect for the completion of the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. And Michelangelo turns up for the audience wearing his shabby work clothes splattered with plaster and paint, wearing an old battered felt hat, and he says to the Pope, my painting absorbs me completely. I've no time for useless conversations, and walks out. A little insight into this mindset of this genius. The history of St. Peter's is absolutely fascinating. There's been a church on the site of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome since the 4th century AD. And it had been added to piecemeal and piecemeal and piecemeal, so that by 1400 it was a great conglomeration of buildings stuck one upon another, most of which were in severe disrepair. And the only solution, it seemed, was to demolish the whole thing and start over. And so in 1506, a foundation stone was laid for the St. Peter's Basilica we know today. But 40 years on, this is what it looked like from a contemporary engraving. Open to the skies, walls that had been designed and then had to be knocked down and redesigned, and Michelangelo's task was to produce a definitive study for the completion of the basilica. And what he came up with is this. It was built based on the original Bramante design from 1506, which had subsequently been modified by many other architects, including the wretched Raphael, can you believe. And Michelangelo comes up with this design in which Bramante's original concept of a squat little dome in a square structure was modified, and Michelangelo's contribution here in this design, which was never really achieved, but at least it was submitted, was to raise the dome on a drum of slender columns. And that was a Michelangelo original. Why? So that the dome would then rise above everything else and be the symbol of the church. He rounded out Bramante's rather square bastions on either end and enlarged the windows so light could flood in. And he gave that to the Pope, and then for 2 years occupied himself doing other architectural projects in the city of Rome. Work was never actually done, but then the Pope dies and another Pope comes on. Now he takes the name, this is the 5th Pope who has employed Michelangelo, can you believe? And the 5th Pope, who takes the name now of Julius III, calls Michelangelo. He says, look, I've just inherited this enormous problem. The basilica is still not built. Please tell me what your plans are. It must be finished. So in shabby old clothes, Michelangelo turns up again and he says to the Pope, I'm not obliged to discuss with your eminence or anyone else what I ought or intend to do. Your duty is to collect the money and guard it against thieves. Can you imagine? Michelangelo's original dome, in fact, was then distorted by a subsequent architect, and the dome was never completed until 18 years after Michelangelo actually died. And there's the dome itself, which has now lost its magnificent serenity of a hemisphere and is now elongated and looks to my eye something like the upper half of a Fabergé egg. But there it is. What about Michelangelo's sexuality? We've seen a lot about his personality and his mindset. Michelangelo never married. He was also, but not widely known, an excellent poet, writing many sonnets. And here is a page from one of the sonnets that he wrote, which was a homage to a 25-year-old young man of exquisite handsomeness who was the son of a Florentine banker. Michelangelo wrote this sonnet in praise of this young man when he was 57 years old, saying that this young man was exquisite and had given him a new lease on life. What was the nature of this relationship? Bear in mind...